So welcome back to another little video around gender-based violence, the 16 days of activism, where our parish, St. Charles Borromeo of Victory Park, is putting up a few little videos. Today we have, I think, quite a well-known parishioner, Claudine Ribeiro, who's been a parishioner here, she says, all her life. Claudine Ribeiro is a social worker by profession. She has worked for the Family and Community Services at the Catholic Women's League. She's been a statutory social worker. She's worked in schools and different organizations. Her bio goes on. She's also been a junior lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand. And she's currently the director of the Johannesburg Parent and Counselling Centre. In Johannesburg, whereabouts are you?
We're based in Parktown and also in Soweto, but we work in schools throughout the area.
So welcome, Claudine, and thank you for your time. I know you're a very busy lady. So maybe you just want to explain a little bit about what is gender-based violence, in terms that, everybody can understand.
Yeah, I think gender-based violence is a very it's a term that everyone just throws around now, but it's quite a broad term. It refers to any kind of violence, harassment or abuse, generally of one person to another, one gender to another. But we find, especially in a country such as South Africa, we find that it's mainly women that are targeted. And broadly speaking, gender-based violence does include any sort of violence that's perpetrated against children. So I think if we're looking at the whole kind of broad definition, we have to include everything in gender-based violence, and that will go from emotional abuse, maybe verbal abuse or verbal attacking of one's spouse or somebody at work. It could include sexual abuse, emotional sort of blackmail, and obviously the more common types of gender-based violence are the physical assault and the sexual assault, which we know we have very high levels of rape in South Africa.
And just in your opinion, why are there such high levels of gender-based violence in our country?
So I think it's important to know that research indicates that no single society around the world is free of gender-based violence. It exists everywhere, but obviously in some societies there's more of it than there is. And South Africa happens to have very high levels of gender-based violence. I think it goes back to the culture of violence that we've had in our history for many centuries, starting with the colonial era, moving through the apartheid era, and more recent events of violence that have occurred in our history, such as Marikana. It's just a culture of violence that exists. If you put together with that misogyny, which is men's hatred of women, I know it sounds very technical, but these things exist. And the idea of patriarchy, which means that the male is much more dominant in our society. I think if you put those three factors together, you're going to end up with high levels of gender-based violence. We've had COVID recently, which means a lot of people have been struggling financially. They've been battling at home, long periods of sitting at home, a lot of high density of people in a small area. That's where you have situations of gender-based violence. So if you put all those factors together in our country, we tick most of those boxes, and that's why it's really so high here.
Wow. And then do you see a lot of it in your work? I mean, how does it manifest in the work that you do? How do you see it?
We see a lot of gender-based violence in the work that we do. So we're a broad-based counselling service. We do counselling of children, adults, couples, so any kind of situation that needs counselling. We also do trauma debriefing. So the first space that we would encounter it would be our trauma debriefing program. We do a lot of trauma debriefing around incidents that have happened of violence against women, against children. We also then what happens is that people come for counseling and there's a presenting problem that doesn't include gender-based violence. And then after a few sessions, you find out that there is an incident of violence that's happened in their history. A child at one of our schools will disclose that they've been sexually abused. A woman will disclose that her partner is hurting her, or a situation like that where and that sadly is the thing, is very often people are scared to be upfront about it, and that's also why we have high levels in this country, is that there is this tendency to hide it as if it's something shameful. Instead of saying, look what's happened to me, and then all systems rush in to protect the woman, we have a situation where our systems don't necessarily protect our victims. And that's why we also have high levels of it. So it comes up sort of indirectly. Eventually, you can't get into the counseling process without it actually raising its head. And that's when we discover that they have it. There's also a lot of anxiety and depression and other mental health challenges at the moment. And when we have found that when we dig a little bit deeper, there's very often an incident or a series of incidents or a history or childhood of gender-based violence
and abuse. Yeah. And I suppose many, with the cultural understanding of where women's place is in their relationships, and it's particularly in our country, I'm sure you've also seen a lot of related factors and ongoing violence in families. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There is so much violence in families. We still, I will go into a school and do a talk with parents, and they say, but we hit our children, and it's against the law. You can't even give them a tap. And some people say, but that's wrong. I should, biblically, I should be allowed to hit my child. It says so in the Bible, spare the rod. The reality is, in our country, we don't allow it. But unfortunately, there are high levels of corporal punishment at home. And, where does corporal punishment end and abuse start? And I think the idea behind the constitutional ruling was that there is no line. And we don't want to put that in the hands of parents because it can become blurred so easily. So rather find alternative ways. And so we try and teach people alternative ways of parenting, of disciplining, and there are ways and means to do it. But unfortunately, the hitting is the thing that comes most naturally to people, and they tend to do it. And then when you introduce situations of alcoholism or, other social factors, then it can escalate very quickly. But we do find that there is corporal punishment that's used quite a lot in our families, and that families don't have another backup plan. They don't have the skills around using other parenting techniques.
Sure, Claudine, we could go on.
We could.
Yes, there's a lot here, but thank you. Those are very precious nuggets that you've put out there, and I think that's what the idea of this little video is. And if anybody wants to make contact with Claudine, her details will come up after this video, or you can contact the parish office. Claudine, thanks for your time. And
it's a pleasure.
We'll probably do this again next year. Thank you.